Did you know medieval queens weren't just about lavish gowns and courtly love? From the 6th century to the 15th, some of history's most powerful women orchestrated betrayals so shocking, they still make jaws drop today. What lengths would a queen go to for power, revenge, or survival? Prepare yourself for tales of political deceit, family feuds, and chilling ambition. Number 14. Anne Neville's calculated alliances. Anne Neville's life was a whirlwind of political ambition and survival in the brutally unpredictable Wars of the Roses. Born in 1456, she was the daughter of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, a man so influential. He was known as the Kingmaker. From her earliest years, Anne was a pawn in her father's grand schemes, a tool for forging alliances and securing power. Her first significant betrayal, if it can be called, that was a shift in loyalty forced upon her by her own family. Initially, Warwick was a staunch supporter of the House of York, which had placed Edward IV on the throne. This meant Anne grew up in a world where the Yorkist cause was paramount. However, the political winds shifted dramatically. Warwick, feeling slighted and undervalued by King Edward IV, decided to switch his allegiance to the deposed Lancastrian monarch Henry VI. This was a monumental betrayal of Edward IV. A king Warwick had helped create, Anne was directly involved in this astonishing turn of events. In 1470, at the tender age of 14, Anne was married to Edward of Westminster, the only son and heir of the Lancastrian King Henry VI and Queen Margaret of Anjou. This marriage was the cornerstone of Warwick's new alliance with the Lancastrians. For Anne, this meant abandoning her upbringing within the Yorkist sphere and aligning herself with the very family her father had fought for years. She became the Princess of Wales, the future Queen of England, but only if the Lancastrians could reclaim their throne. This alliance was a direct betrayal of the Yorkist cause, and by extension a betrayal of the stability of England, which had only recently settled under Edward IV. The wedding itself took place in Angers Cathedral, in France, a testament to the urgency and political gravity of the union. It was a clear signal that the Kingmaker had abandoned his former allies and was actively working to overthrow the current king. The newly formed Lancastrian alliance, bolstered by French support, managed to briefly restore Henry VI to the throne, but this triumph was short-lived. Edward IV, with the support of his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, returned to England in 1471. The decisive battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury followed, and the Lancastrian cause was utterly crushed. At Tewkesbury, Anne's husband, Edward of Westminster, was killed. Her father, Warwick, was also killed at Barnet. Suddenly, Anne was a widow, a captured prize, and a young woman in an incredibly precarious position. Her new status, however, opened the door for another shocking turn of events. Following the defeat, Anne was initially taken into custody by George, Duke of Clarence, her sister, Isabel's husband, and Warwick's other son-in-law. Clarence sought to control Anne's inheritance, which included significant lands. However, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, King Edward IV's younger brother, also had designs on Anne and her wealth. Richard and Anne had known each other since childhood, and some chroniclers suggest a prior affection. What transpired next was a complex negotiation, a struggle between two powerful brothers over a young woman and her vast inheritance. Richard actively sought to marry Anne, which would not only grant him control of her lands, but also potentially legitimize his claim to them against Clarence. To marry Richard, Anne would have to align herself with the very family responsible for the deaths of her father and her husband, the Yorkists. This was perhaps the ultimate betrayal of her short-lived Lancastrian allegiance. Historical accounts suggest Anne was initially reluctant, perhaps even hiding in a London cookshop to avoid Clarence's schemes. But the political reality was stark. She was a prisoner of war, and marrying Richard offered the best chance for security, influence, and perhaps even survival. In 1472, she married Richard. This marriage represented a complete repudiation of her Lancastrian past and a full embrace of the Yorkist cause despite the personal cost. She became Queen of England in 1483, when Richard ascended the throne as Richard III, following the controversial disappearance of the princes in the Tower. Her journey from Lancastrian bride to Yorkist queen was a testament to her adaptability and the profound betrayals inherent in the struggle for the English crown. Number 13. Elizabeth Woodville's Shifting Sands. Elizabeth Woodville, born around 1437, was a woman who navigated the treacherous waters of the Wars of the Roses with remarkable skill and at times with a willingness to abandon former loyalties for the sake of her family's advancement. Her rise to power was itself a shocking development for many. She was a Lancastrian supporter, a widow with 2 young sons from her first marriage to Sir John Grey of Groby, who died fighting for the Lancastrian cause at the Second Battle of St. Albans. Her husband's lands were forfeited, leaving her in a difficult position. Yet in 1464 she secretly married the newly crowned Yorkist King Edward IV. This marriage was a scandalous affair, kept secret for months, and once revealed it sent shockwaves through the English court. Edward IV's chief advisor, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, had been negotiating a French alliance for the king, and Elizabeth's marriage undermined all his efforts. The initial act of marrying Edward IV was a betrayal of the political norms and expectations of the time. Kings were expected to marry for political alliance, not for love, and certainly not a commoner widow with Lancastrian connections. It alienated Warwick and many of the old nobility who saw the Woodvilles as upstart. Elizabeth immediately began to leverage her position as queen to advance her large family. Her brothers and sisters were married into prominent noble families, and her sons from her first marriage were given advantageous positions. This rapid elevation of the Woodville family at the expense of established magnates was perceived by many as a betrayal of the existing power structure and a sign of Elizabeth's unbridled ambition. It created deep resentment, particularly from Warwick and Edward IV's brothers, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. The resentment culminated in Warwick's rebellion against Edward IV. Elizabeth and her family bore the brunt of Warwick's animosity. During periods of Edward IV's temporary overthrow, Elizabeth found herself in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, giving birth to her daughter Elizabeth of York while surrounded by political turmoil. When Edward IV regained the throne, the Woodvilles returned to prominence, and their influence grew stronger than ever. However, Elizabeth's most chilling perceived betrayal came after Edward IV's sudden death in April 1483. Her son, Edward V, was the heir, but he was only 12 years old. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's younger brother, was appointed Lord Protector. The initial agreement between Elizabeth and Richard was one of cooperation for the young king's smooth succession. However, Richard quickly moved to seize control. He intercepted Edward V on his journey to London and then took custody of Edward V's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, also from Elizabeth. Both boys were lodged in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their safety, pending the coronation. The next step was devastating. Richard III, with the support of a segment of the nobility, declared Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth invalid, citing a pre-contract. This rendered all of Elizabeth's children illegitimate and cleared the way for Richard to claim the throne himself. In this desperate situation, Elizabeth Woodville made a series of critical decisions that, while perhaps born of survival, could be seen as profound betrayals. After her sons, the princes in the Tower, disappeared from public view and were widely believed to have been murdered, Elizabeth found herself without her male heirs. Rather than continuing to fight for the Lancastrian cause, or even for her son's supposed legitimacy, she formed a shocking alliance with Margaret Beaufort, the mother of the leading Lancastrian claimant, Henry Tudor. This alliance involved the plan to marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, to Henry Tudor, thereby uniting the warring houses of York and Lancaster, and presenting a unified front against Richard III. This agreement, forged in secret, was a direct betrayal of her loyalty to her own Yorkist lineage and the memory of her husband, Edward IV. It was a strategic, cynical move, but it paved the way for Henry Tudor's invasion and ultimate victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. While it brought an end to the Wars of the Roses, for many it was a striking example of a queen who would betray any loyalty to secure a future for her surviving family, even if it meant aligning with her husband's deadliest enemies. Number 12. Margaret of Anjou's unyielding warfare. Margaret of Anjou, born in 1430, was a formidable queen. The wife of King Henry VI of England, and a central, often ruthless figure in the bloody conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. Her reign was characterized by her husband's mental instability and her own determined efforts to preserve the Lancastrian dynasty against the rising power of the House of York. Her betrayals were less about personal treachery and more about a relentless pursuit of her dynastic goals, often at the expense of peace-established agreements and the lives of her enemies. Her most significant series of betrayals involved her refusal to accept any compromise with the Yorkists, particularly Richard, Duke of York. In 1455, the First Battle of St. Albans marked the beginning of open warfare. Henry VI was captured, and Richard of York asserted his dominance. Despite calls for reconciliation, Margaret steadfastly opposed any attempt by York to gain more power, seeing him as a direct threat to her young son Edward, Prince of Wales. In 1460, after York achieved a significant victory at the Battle of Northampton, the Act of Accord was passed, effectively disinheriting Margaret's son and naming Richard of York as Henry VI's heir. This was a profound humiliation for Margaret. Instead of accepting this settlement, which was intended to bring an end to the destructive civil war, Margaret saw it as a monumental betrayal of her son's birthright. She refused to acknowledge the Act of Accord. She mobilized her forces in the north, gathering an army to confront York. This act was a direct betrayal of the parliamentary agreement and a deliberate choice to reignite the conflict rather than accepting a peaceful, albeit unfavorable, resolution. Margaret led her army south, and in December 1460, at the Battle of Wakefield, her forces decisively defeated Richard of York's army. York himself was killed along with his second son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, and his brother-in-law, Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury. Following this victory, Margaret allowed a brutal display of vindictiveness that solidified her image as the she-wolf of France. York's head was placed on the Micklegate Bar in York, adorned with a paper crown, a chilling mockery of his royal aspirations. This act was a betrayal of any pretense of chivalry or a peaceful resolution. It was a clear signal that Margaret would stop at nothing. She continued her march south, winning another victory at the Second Battle of St. Albans in February 1461, where she successfully rescued her husband, Henry VI. This path of continued warfare, despite opportunities for negotiation, was a persistent betrayal of attempts to end a devastating conflict. Even after her son Edward was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, and her husband, Henry VI, was murdered in the Tower of London. Margaret's determination was unwavering. She was captured after Tewkesbury and eventually ransomed by Louis XI of France in 1475. She spent her remaining years in France still nursing dreams of restoring the Lancastrian line, though her direct involvement in warfare ended. Her life was a testament to a queen who, driven by fierce maternal love and dynastic loyalty, consistently chose the path of conflict and rejected any compromise that would diminish her son's claim to the throne. Her actions prolonged the Wars of the Roses for decades, leading to immense suffering and earning her a reputation for unyielding and often ruthless betrayal of those who stood in her family's way. Number 11. Joanna I of Naples and the Fatal Conspiracy. Joanna, the first Queen of Naples, born in 1326, inherited a complex and volatile kingdom, plagued by dynastic struggles and ambitious relatives. Her reign began under the shadow of her arranged marriage to her cousin Andrew of Hungary in 1334. This union was politically motivated, intended to solidify alliances and bring stability to the region. However, the marriage was deeply unhappy and fraught with tension. Andrew, a rough and unsophisticated Hungarian prince, felt disrespected and undermined by the Neapolitan court, which viewed him as an outsider. He was also ambitious and demanded to be crowned king rather than merely prince consort, a move that would significantly diminish Joanna's power and autonomy. This ambition caused great friction with Joanna's own family and her advisors, who feared a Hungarian takeover of the Neapolitan throne. The escalating animosity between Joanna and Andrew reached its peak in September 1345. Andrew, having received papal permission to be crowned king, was preparing for the ceremony. The Neapolitan court, however, was rife with conspiracies against him. On the night of September 18, 1345, while staying at Aversa, a hunting lodge outside Naples, a horrifying event unfolded. Andrew was lured from his bedroom, ostensibly to discuss an urgent matter, by a group of conspirators. He was seized, gagged, and brutally murdered. Historical accounts describe him being strangled with a silk cord and then thrown from a window where his body was left exposed in the garden. The immediate aftermath of Andrew's murder pointed suspicion directly at Joanna. She was present at the lodge that night. While she denied direct involvement, her failure to apprehend the murderers, some of whom were her close confidants and members of her court, and her subsequent marriage to Louis of Taranto, one of her cousins, of her complicity. Louis of Taranto, who was deeply unpopular with Andrew, benefited directly from the murder, as he then married Joanna and became king consort. This swift remarriage, less than a year after Andrew's death, was seen by many as a clear indication of her guilt and a betrayal of her marital vows. The murder of Andrew sparked outrage, particularly from his brother Louis I of Hungary, who vowed revenge. Louis of Hungary launched an invasion of Naples in 1347 explicitly to avenge his brother's death. He publicly accused Joanna of regicide and matricide, branding her a murderous adulteress. Joanna was forced to flee Naples for Avignon, where she appealed to Pope Clement VI for protection and a public trial. In Avignon, Joanna stood trial before the Pope and his cardinals. She defended herself eloquently, arguing that she had been under duress and that her actions were not those of a willing participant in the murder. She even agreed to sell the city of Avignon to the papacy in exchange for her exoneration. The Pope, perhaps swayed by her arguments, the compelling evidence of her precarious position, or the substantial sum of money, ultimately declared her innocent of the murder. However, this acquittal did little to clear her name in the eyes of many, especially Louis of Hungary and the people of Naples, who continued to believe she had betrayed her husband. Despite the papal verdict, Joanna's life continued to be marked by conflict and further accusations of betrayal. She ruled Naples for another 3 decades, facing numerous challenges, including invasions, political intrigue, and the constant threat of deposition. Her involvement, or at least her perceived complicity in Andrew's murder, remained a stain on her reputation, and a testament to the extreme lengths to which a queen might go to secure her own power and freedom from an unwanted, overbearing spouse. Her decision to marry Louis of Taranto so quickly after Andrew's death, a man seen as his enemy, was a potent symbol of her willingness to betray the memory of her first marriage for political and personal gain. Number 10. Isabella of France, the she-wolf's rage. Isabella of France, born in 1295, was a queen of England whose story embodies one of the most dramatic and devastating betrayals in medieval history. Married to King Edward II in 1308, she was initially a figure of elegance and political alliance, but her life quickly descended into a chilling narrative of resentment and revolution. Edward II was a deeply unpopular king, known for his military failures, his neglect of governance, and, most crucially, his favoritism towards a series of male courtiers, most notably Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger. These favorites monopolized royal patronage, undermined the power of the English nobility, and openly insulted the queen. Isabella, a daughter of the powerful King Philip IV of France, found herself increasingly moralized and humiliated at the English court. Edward's blatant disregard for her, and his lavish gifts to Despenser, caused her immense suffering. Despenser, in particular, grew so powerful and arrogant that he even encroached on Isabella's personal property and influence, confiscating her lands and jewels. This betrayal of her queenly status and her personal dignity ignited a simmering rage within Isabella. By the mid-1320s, the relationship between Isabella and Edward II had completely broken down. In 1325, a critical opportunity arose. Isabella's brother, Charles IV, King of France, demanded homage from Edward II for the English Gascon territories. Edward, unwilling to leave England and face his rebellious barons, sent Isabella to France as his emissary to negotiate. This diplomatic mission became the stage for Isabella's ultimate act of betrayal. While in France, Isabella refused to return to England, openly stating she would not do so as long as Despenser remained in power. More significantly, she formed an illicit relationship with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had been exiled to France for his opposition to Edward II and the Despensers. This alliance between Isabella and Mortimer was a profound betrayal of her husband and king. They became lovers and, more importantly, political conspirators. Together they began to plot Edward II's overthrow. Isabella, using her royal connections and charisma, secured support from her brother, Charles IV, and other discontented English exiles. She raised an army, financed largely by the Count of Hainaut, whose daughter Philippa was betrothed to Isabella's son, the young Prince Edward. In September 1326, Isabella and Mortimer launched their invasion of England. This was an unprecedented act, a queen leading an army against her own husband. The invasion was remarkably successful. Edward II, abandoned by many of his former supporters, fled and was eventually captured. The Despensers were also apprehended and suffered gruesome public executions. Hugh Despenser, the younger, was drawn, hanged, and quartered, a brutal display of the victor's revenge. With Edward II, imprisoned Isabella and Mortimer, effectively ruled England through the young Prince Edward, who was proclaimed King Edward III in January 1327. But the ultimate betrayal was yet to come. While Isabella had not called for Edward II's death, his continued existence posed a threat. In September 1327, King Edward II died in Berkeley Castle under highly suspicious circumstances. Though officially recorded as natural causes, it was widely believed, and historical evidence strongly suggests that he was brutally murdered on Isabella and Mortimer's orders, possibly by inserting a red-hot poker into his anus. This horrific act sealed their power but cemented Isabella's reputation as the she-wolf of France, a queen who betrayed her marital vows, her loyalty to the crown, and ultimately her husband's life for vengeance and power. Her actions set a chilling precedent for royal overthrow in English history. Number 9. Blanch of Castile's Iron Will. Blanch of Castile, born in 1188, was Queen of France through her marriage to King Louis VIII, and later, one of the most powerful and effective regents in French history for her young son, Louis IX. Her reign as regent was marked by an unwavering determination to preserve and consolidate royal power, often at the expense of the great feudal lords who sought to exploit the fragility of a child king's rule. Her betrayals were not of personal trust in the typical sense, but rather a consistent and ruthless suppression of those who challenged the royal authority she so fiercely protected, perceived by the rebellious nobles as a betrayal of their traditional rights. When Louis VIII died prematurely in 1226, his eldest son, Louis IX, was only 12 years old. The French kingdom, recently expanded by Louis VIII, was still a patchwork of powerful semi-independent lordships, many of whom saw the regency as an opportunity to regain lost power and territory. Blanche, a Spanish princess by birth, was viewed with suspicion by many French nobles. Yet she immediately took firm control of the regency, surprising everyone with her political acumen and unyielding will. Her first major test came with a series of baronial revolts led by powerful figures like Peter Mauclair, Duke of Brittany, and Hugh X of Lusignan. These lords, including some who had sworn fealty to the young king, formed leagues against the crown, claiming to be protecting the realm from an unpopular foreign queen and her perceived overreach. Blanche's response was swift and decisive. She personally led armies, demonstrating a courage and strategic mind rarely seen in queens of the era. She refused to negotiate away royal power or make significant concessions to the rebellious barons. One clear instance of her perceived betrayal of noble expectations was her handling of the rebellious Count Raymond, the Seventh of Toulouse. Raymond had allied with the rebellious barons and continued his father's struggle against the crown in the Languedoc. Blanche, instead of allowing for a lenient peace, relentlessly pursued the war against him. In 1229, she forced Raymond VII to sign the humiliating Treaty of Paris. This treaty stipulated that Raymond must marry his only daughter and heir to Louis IX's brother, Alphonse of Poitiers, effectively transferring the vast county of Toulouse to the French crown upon Raymond's death. Furthermore, it dismantled the fortifications of many southern castles and established the University of Toulouse to suppress heresy. This was a profound betrayal of Raymond's independence and feudal rights, turning his powerful domain into a royal possession. Blanche's actions against the barons were seen by them as a betrayal of the feudal compact, where the king, even a regent, was expected to respect the traditional rights and autonomy of his great vassals. She consistently undermined their attempts to challenge central authority, often through military force, strategic marriages for her children, and shrewd political maneuvering. She cultivated support from the church and the emerging urban centers, playing them against the feudal nobility. For example, she ensured that the rebellious Duke Peter Mauclair of Brittany was isolated and ultimately forced into submission. While he was a royal vassal, his repeated defiance was met with unwavering force and the breaking of his power. By the time Louis IX came of age and took full control of the kingdom, Blanche had successfully quelled the baronial rebellions, consolidated royal authority, and expanded the crown's territorial control. Her ruthless efficiency and political astuteness, though framed by her as loyal service to her son and the kingdom, were perceived by many of the powerful lords as a systematic betrayal of their autonomy and a complete disregard for their traditional positions within the realm. She acted not as a conciliator, but as a determined sovereign who would break any opposing force to secure her son's throne. Number 8. Eleanor of Aquitaine's rebellious heart. Eleanor of Aquitaine, born in 1122, was arguably one of the most powerful and influential women of the Middle Ages. Her life was a testament to ambition, political acumen, and a willingness to defy conventional expectations, leading to one of history's most famous royal betrayals. Initially Queen of France, through her marriage to Louis VII, she divorced him in 1152 after a contentious and childless union. Just 8 weeks later, she shocked Europe by marrying Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, who was 11 years her junior. This second marriage was a monumental betrayal of her former husband and of the traditional balance of power in France, as it immediately transferred her vast wealthy duchy of Aquitaine to Henry, making him the most powerful vassal in France, controlling more territory than the French king himself. 2 years later, in 1154, Henry became king, Henry II of England, establishing the Angevin Empire, a sprawling dominion that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. For over a decade, Eleanor was Queen of England, giving birth to a large brood of children, including 4 sons who would live to adulthood: Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, and John. However, Henry II, an energetic and often tyrannical ruler, began to restrict Eleanor's power and influence, particularly in her beloved Aquitaine. He centralized power, appointed his own administrators, and frequently kept Eleanor confined to England, away from her ancestral lands. This curtailment of her authority and the public humiliation of Henry's numerous affairs, especially with Rosamund Clifford, fueled a deep resentment in Eleanor. The ultimate betrayal orchestrated by Eleanor began in 1173. Her sons, particularly the eldest, Henry the young king, felt increasingly sidelined and denied real power by their father. Henry the young king, despite being crowned co-king, had no actual authority or independent income. Richard and Geoffrey also desired their own territories and influence. Seeing their discontent, Eleanor actively encouraged and supported their rebellion against their father. This was a profound act of betrayal, a queen inciting her own sons to wage war against their husband and king. Eleanor facilitated her sons' escape from Henry II's court and helped them find refuge and support with her former husband, Louis VII of France, who was always eager to destabilize the Angevin Empire. She sent her younger sons to Louis's court, essentially handing them over to Henry II's greatest rival. She also returned to Aquitaine and actively rallied her own vassals to join the rebellion. She personally rode through the duchy, urging her nobility to rise against Henry II. This act of directly challenging her husband's rule, raising troops against him and aligning with his enemies, was an undeniable declaration of war. Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174 was a massive conflict involving France, Scotland, Brittany, and numerous English and Angevin nobles, all united by Eleanor's Incurry II. For Eleanor, this was not just a political maneuver, but a personal war to reclaim her autonomy and assert her will. When the rebellion was ultimately crushed by Henry II, who proved to be a formidable military commander, Eleanor was captured. Her punishment was severe. Henry II had her imprisoned for 16 long years, first at Chinon and later at Salisbury and Winchester. She remained in captivity, albeit with some privileges, until Henry II's death in 1189. Her sons, too, suffered the consequences, though they were eventually reconciled with their father. Eleanor's decision to pit her sons against their father and actively participate in the rebellion remains one of the most shocking and enduring examples of a medieval queen's direct betrayal of her royal husband. Number 7. Matilda of England's broken peace. Matilda of England, born in 1102, was a formidable figure whose life was defined by a relentless struggle for the English throne known as the Anarchy. As the daughter of King Henry I of England, she was his only legitimate surviving child, and Henry had gone to great lengths to ensure her succession. He compelled his barons to swear oaths recognizing her as his heir, an unprecedented move for a female monarch in England. However, upon Henry I's death in 1135, her cousin Stephen of Blois seized the throne, claiming it as his own. This act immediately set the stage for a long and brutal civil war. Matilda's initial struggle was a fight for her rightful inheritance, not a betrayal. But as the conflict progressed, she made decisions and alliances that could be seen as betrayals of attempts at peace and a prolonged disregard for the suffering of her people, all in pursuit of her claim. Her core betrayal was her consistent unwillingness to compromise, even when political realities suggested a different path. One key moment came in 1141. After years of skirmishes, Matilda's forces captured King Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln. She was briefly recognized as Lady of the English and entered London preparing for her coronation. This was a moment where the conflict could have ended. However, Matilda's arrogant and imperious demeanor alienated the very people whose support she needed, especially the citizens of London and the powerful church. She refused to grant liberties, imposed heavy taxes, and dismissed the appeals of Stephen's wife, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, who pleaded for her husband's release. Her inability to garner the support of the Londoners and her perceived inflexibility led to her being driven out of the city before her coronation could take place. This was a direct consequence of her failure to honor the implicit trust and expectations of those who might have supported her, essentially betraying the opportunity for a swift and relatively peaceful end to the conflict. Her actions were seen as a betrayal of the common good and the needs of the kingdom for peace and stability. The Civil War continued for another decade, marked by constant sieges, devastation of land, and lawlessness. Stephen eventually rallied his forces and captured Matilda's half-brother and most powerful ally, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, leading to a prisoner exchange that freed Stephen. Matilda herself was almost captured on several occasions, famously escaping through the snow at Oxford in a white cloak. Throughout this period, numerous attempts were made to negotiate a lasting peace between the two factions. Each time, Matilda's unyielding determination to reclaim what she saw as her birthright often led her to reject terms that might have brought an earlier end to the bloodshed. Her stubbornness, while a testament to her resolve, also prolonged the suffering of England. The ultimate resolution, the Treaty of Winchester in 1153, finally brought the war to a close. It stipulated that Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but upon his death, Matilda's son, Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II, would succeed him. This was a compromise that Matilda herself accepted, but only after decades of brutal conflict. Her refusal to compromise earlier, her perceived haughtiness that drove away potential allies, and her persistent pursuit of her claim through warfare, even when peace was a possibility, could be viewed as a betrayal of her responsibility to her people and the kingdom. Chroniclers of the time frequently lamented the widespread suffering caused by the anarchy, a direct result of the prolonged contest between Matilda and Stephen, fueled by Matilda's refusal to yield. Number 6. Emma of Normandy's shifting loyalties. Emma of Normandy, born around 988, was a powerful and influential queen, a bridge between two dynasties in England and a key player in the turbulent political landscape of the early 11th century. Her life was marked by a series of strategic marriages and consequently several instances of shifting loyalties that could be perceived as betrayals. She was first married to King Aethelred, the Unready of England, in 1002, a union intended to secure an alliance with Normandy against Viking raids. With Aethelred, she had two sons, Edward, later Edward the Confessor, and Alfred. However, the Viking threat intensified. In 1013, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard invaded England, forcing Aethelred and Emma to flee to Normandy. Sweyn died shortly after, and Aethelred returned to England, only to die in 1016. His son from a previous marriage, Edmund Ironside, continued the fight against the new Danish invader, Canute the Great. When Edmund also died later that year, Canute seized the English throne. This presented Emma with a crucial choice. Instead of remaining loyal to the sons of her first marriage, Edward and Alfred, who were still in Normandy, she chose to marry Canute in 1017. This was a stunning political maneuver, and a profound betrayal of her first husband's legacy and her own children from that union. By marrying the conqueror of England, she secured her own position as queen and ensured a degree of stability for the realm, but at the cost of abandoning her elder son's claims to the English throne. She had a son with Canute Harthacnut. Emma continued to exert significant influence during Canute's reign, participating in his court and traveling with him. After Canute's death in 1035, the succession became complicated. Canute had two sons, Harold Harefoot, from a previous relationship, and Emma's son, Harthacnut. Emma actively championed Harthacnut's claim, effectively betraying Harold. More controversially, during this period, her two sons from her first marriage, Edward and Alfred, returned to England. What transpired next is a shadowy but chilling event. Alfred was captured by supporters of Harold Harefoot, brutally blinded, and died shortly after. While the exact extent of Emma's involvement is debated, her perceived inaction or even implicit support for Harold at this critical juncture, when she was a powerful figure. Some chroniclers even accuse her of not intervening to protect her sons, or of even being involved in a plot to lure Alfred to England. Emma's political maneuvering continued. When Harthacnut finally secured the throne in 1040, Emma remained a prominent figure. However, upon Harthacnut's death in 1042, it was her son from her first marriage, Edward the Confessor, who became king. Emma, who had largely neglected Edward during his long exile, now expected to wield influence through him. But Edward, remembering his mother's abandonment and her perceived role in Alfred's death, harbored deep resentment. In 1043, Edward the Confessor launched a decisive move against his mother. He rode to Winchester with his most trusted advisors and confiscated Emma's vast wealth and lands. She was stripped of her possessions and confined to the monastery at Whirlwind, effectively ending her political career. This act, while carried out by her son, was a direct consequence of her lifetime of shifting allegiances and calculated betrayals of family ties for political gain. Her numerous changes of loyalty from Aethelred to Canute, and then from her elder sons to her younger, left her vulnerable and ultimately led to her own downfall. She died in 1052, a queen who had outmaneuvered many, but whose tactical betrayals ultimately cost her the trust of those closest to her. Number 5. Judith of Bavaria's Imperial Ambition. Judith of Bavaria, born around 797, became the second wife of Louis the Pious, Emperor of the Carolingian Empire. In 819, her arrival at the imperial court brought a new dynamic to a realm already wrestling with succession issues. Louis already had 3 adult sons from his first marriage: Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German. These sons had already been designated as heirs to various parts of the empire under Louis the Pious's Ordinatio Imperii of 817, which sought to establish a clear line of succession and avoid fragmentation. Judith, however, was determined to secure a prominent position for her own son Charles, born in 823. Her ambition for Charles, who would later be known as Charles the Bald, became the catalyst for a series of political maneuvers and perceived betrayals that plunged the Carolingian Empire into decades of civil war and instability. This was a betrayal of the established order, a betrayal of the oaths Louis's elder sons had sworn, and a betrayal of the peace that the Ordinatio Imperii was meant to ensure. Judith began to exert immense influence over the aging Emperor Louis. She was intelligent, charming, and politically astute. Chroniclers of the time, often biased against her, depict her as a manipulative figure who persuaded Louis to revise the 817 division of the empire in favor of young Charles. In 829, Louis, under Judith's influence, created a new kingdom, Alemannia, for Charles, carved out of the territories originally designated for his elder sons. This act was a direct betrayal of the Ordinatio Imperii, and a clear signal that Judith was willing to disrupt the established succession to benefit her own child. This revision immediately sparked outrage and resentment among Louis's elder sons. They saw it as a betrayal of their inheritance and a weakening of their own power. The sons, especially Lothair, who was already co-emperor, viewed Judith's influence as an insidious force undermining their father's wisdom and legitimate succession plans. This led to open rebellion. In 830, the elder sons, capitalizing on dissatisfaction with Louis' rule, revolted. Judith was accused of adultery with Bernard of Septimania, a prominent advisor, though these accusations were likely fabricated to discredit her. She was seized and forced to become a nun, while Louis the Pious was temporarily deposed. However, Judith soon regained her influence. Louis managed to regain power, and Judith returned to court more determined than ever. She continued to push for Charles's interests, leading to further redivisions of the empire that alienated the elder sons even more. Each new division, each new kingdom created for Charles, was a fresh betrayal of the previous agreements and a constant source of friction. The years that followed were a cycle of rebellions, reconciliations, and further redivisions, all fueled by Judith's relentless promotion of Charles. After Louis the Pious died in 840, the struggle intensified, turning into a full-blown civil war between the surviving sons. The Treaty of Verdun in 843, which formally divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts, was a direct consequence of the instability and conflict that Judith's actions had exacerbated. Her son Charles the Bald received West Francia, laying the groundwork for what would become France. While Judith achieved her goal of securing a kingdom for Charles, her relentless ambition and manipulation of imperial succession were seen by many as a profound betrayal of family harmony, imperial unity, and the stability of the realm. Her legacy is one of a queen who, driven by fierce maternal love and political cunning, shattered an empire for her son's benefit. Number 4. Empress Irene of Athens. The Blinding Mother. Empress Irene of Athens, born around 752, rose from humble origins to become one of the most powerful and ruthless figures in Byzantine history. Her reign was marked by a profound theological struggle over iconoclasm, and most shockingly, by an act of political betrayal against her own son. She married Emperor Leo IV in 769 and became Empress Consort. When Leo died in 780, their 9-year-old son, Constantine VI, ascended to the throne, and Irene became regent. From the outset, Irene was a determined and ambitious regent. Her primary political goal was to restore the veneration of icons, which had been outlawed by her iconoclast predecessors. This was a dangerous policy in a deeply divided empire. She used her position to systematically remove iconoclast officials and appoint her own supporters. While this was a policy choice, her subsequent actions regarding her son were far more personal and truly shocking. As Constantine VI grew older, he naturally wished to assert his own authority and rule independently. He began to chafe under his mother's control and influence. At first, Irene attempted to maintain her regency by trying to force him into marriage with a Frankish princess, a union that Constantine resisted. He also made efforts to break free from his mother's circle of advisors. This growing tension between mother and son led to a series of power struggles. In 790, Constantine VI, supported by the army, successfully overthrew his mother's regency and took full control of the empire. Irene was confined to her palace, and her trusted eunuch Staurakios was stripped of his power. This marked a temporary victory for Constantine. However, Irene, ever the schemer, gradually began to regain influence. She managed to manipulate her son into restoring her to her former position as Empress Dowager, ostensibly as an advisor, a move that proved to be a fatal mistake for Constantine. She quickly re-established her network of loyalists within the court and the army. The ultimate betrayal came in 797. Irene, unwilling to relinquish power entirely and fearing that Constantine might eventually remove her, completely orchestrated a chilling plot against him. She had her supporters seize Constantine VI. On August 15, 797, in the very room of the Imperial palace where he had been born, Constantine VI was brutally blinded on his mother's orders. The blinding was so severe that some accounts suggest he died from the injury shortly after, though other sources indicate he lingered for some years in obscurity. This act of physically mutilating her own son, the rightful emperor, was a profound and horrifying betrayal of familial bonds, imperial law, and human decency. With Constantine VI incapacitated, Irene declared herself the sole empress, ruling in her own right. She became the first woman to rule the Byzantine Empire in her own name, not as a regent for a male emperor. This extraordinary act cemented her power, but earned her a lasting reputation for ruthlessness. However, her reign was short-lived. Her attempts to secure her power by negotiating a marriage alliance with Charlemagne, the powerful Frankish emperor, further alienated her, and in 802, she was overthrown by a palace coup, Nikephoros. Irene was exiled to Lesbos, where she died the following year. Her blinding of her son, a direct act of political violence against her own flesh and blood to seize absolute power, remains one of the most shocking and infamous betrayals in medieval history. Number 3. Empress Theodora's Iron Grip. Empress Theodora, born around 500 AD, was one of the most influential and formidable women in Byzantine history. Her life was a remarkable journey from humble origins as an actress entersan to co-ruler of the mighty Byzantine Empire. Her betrayals were often of principles or of those who might stand in the way of her and Justinian's absolute authority. One of the most defining moments that showcased Theodoras' ruthless determination and willingness to betray traditional counsel occurred during the Nika riots in 532 AD. This was a massive and violent uprising in Constantinople, sparked by chariot racing factions, but quickly escalating into a full-scale rebellion against Justinian's rule. For 5 days, the city was engulfed in chaos, with much of it burned down. The emperor and his court were trapped in the imperial palace, and many of his advisors urged him to flee the city, believing the situation was hopeless. The city was in flames, the imperial guard was overwhelmed, and the people were calling for a new emperor. At this critical juncture, with Justinian seemingly ready to abandon his throne, Theodora delivered a famous speech, defying the advice of nearly all the male courtiers. She declared that royalty is a good burial shroud, meaning she would rather die as an empress than live as an exile. She scorned the idea of flight and urged Justinian and his generals to stand and fight. This was a pivotal moment where she essentially betrayed the common sense advice of self-preservation and safety, opting instead for a brutal crackdown. Her resolve steeled Justinian's will. Following Theodora's exhortation, Justinian ordered his generals Belisarius and Narses to crush the rebellion. They led a massacre in the Hippodrome, slaughtering tens of thousands of rioters. Theodora's refusal to allow retreat and her insistence on this brutal suppression was a betrayal of the common people's grievances and a deliberate choice for overwhelming force over negotiation. It was a clear signal that she would sanction any means necessary to maintain the imperial power. Beyond the Nika riots, Theodora's influence extended to matters of law and justice. She often used her position to protect and advance the causes of women and the marginalized, which was progressive for her time. However, she also ruthlessly targeted enemies of the state and those who opposed her will. She was instrumental in the downfall of prominent officials and rivals, often through intrigue and manipulation. For instance, John the Cappadocian, a powerful and corrupt Praetorian prefect, was eventually disgraced and exiled largely due to Theodora's machinations. His downfall was orchestrated by Theodora, who allegedly lured him into a trap with a false promise of supporting a conspiracy against Justinian, betraying his trust and leading to his ruin. Another example of her strategic ruthlessness involved her persecution of former associates from her life before Empress. Some historians suggest she used her power to eliminate individuals who knew too much about her past or who could potentially blackmail her. While not a directly proven act of betrayal of a specific individual, it speaks to a pattern of a queen who would go to extreme lengths to protect her image and power. Theodora's rule, though often beneficial for the empire through her support of Justinian's grand projects, was characterized by an unyielding ambition. She frequently overrode the counsel of others, manipulated situations, and ruthlessly eliminated obstacles, betraying any expectation of leniency or traditional methods when her and Justinian's imperial authority was at stake. Her actions solidified the power of the Byzantine throne, but came at the cost of lives and the suppression of any genuine opposition. Number 2. Brunhild of Austrasia's unending feud. Brunhild of Austrasia, born around 543, was a Visigothic princess who became a Frankish queen through her marriage to King Sigebert I of Austrasia. Her life was an epic saga of power struggles, political intrigue, and a bitter decades-long feud with her rival Queen Fredagons that plunged the Frankish kingdoms into devastating civil war. Brunhild's betrayals were often acts of vengeance or calculated political moves to secure her family's power, sometimes at the expense of her own relatives and allies. The root of Brunhild's ruthless actions lay in the murder of her sister Galswinthe. Galswinthe was married to Sigebert's half-brother King Chilperic I of Neustria. Chilperic, however, quickly grew tired of Galswinthe, and under the influence of his mistress Fredagond, had Galswinthe strangled and then married. This brutal act of murder and perceived slight against her family ignited a lifelong vendetta in Brunhild. She swore revenge against Fredagond and Chilperic, setting the stage for decades of violence. Brunhild first convinced Sigebert to wage war against Chilperic to avenge Galswinthe's death and reclaim the dowry. This initial war was a justified act of familial vengeance. However, after Sigebert was assassinated in 575, likely on Fredagond's orders, Brunhild found herself a widow in enemy territory, with a young son, Childebert II, as her only heir. Her subsequent actions were a continuous struggle for survival and power for her son and herself, often involving profound betrayals. Brunhild's most significant betrayals involved her relentless efforts to maintain power during the regency for her young son, Childebert II. She initially faced opposition from the Austrasian nobility, who sought to curb royal power. She fought fiercely against them, aligning herself with various factions and sometimes betraying the traditional rights of the nobles. Her desire for centralized royal power in the Byzantine style clashed with the Frankish noble traditions, making her numerous political opponents. After Childebert II's death in 596, Brunhild became regent for her grandsons, Theodoras II of Austrasia. This is where her betrayals intensified. She openly interfered in the governance of both kingdoms, trying to assert her authority over her adult grandsons. She deliberately stirred up animosity between them. When Theodebert II gained military successes, Brunhild, fearing his independence and power, actively encouraged Theodoric II to wage war against his own brother. This was a clear betrayal of family loyalty and a deliberate act to destabilize the realm for her own political advantage. Brunhild allegedly spread rumors and forged letters to create discord between the brothers. She supported Theodoric II in his campaign to depose and eliminate Theodebert II. Theodoric defeated his brother, and Theodebert, along with his sons, was captured and murdered, or died shortly after, in circumstances that suggest foul play. This act of inciting fratricide was a shocking betrayal of her own family, all to ensure her continued influence over the surviving grandson, Theodoric. However, her manipulation didn't stop there. When Theodoric II died unexpectedly in 613, Brunhild, now in her 70s, attempted to rule through her great-grandsons, all young boys. This final grasp for power alienated the Frankish nobility, who had grown weary of her long tyrannical rule and constant interventions. They rallied around Clothar II, Fredagond's son, and Brunhild's lifelong enemy, and betrayed Brunhild to him. She was captured, subjected to a brutal torture, and then executed by being tied to the tail of a wild horse and dragged to death. Her decades of betraying family, inciting wars, and ruthlessly eliminating rivals ultimately led to her own violent end, a testament to the bitter cycle of vengeance and power in the early medieval Frankish kingdoms. Number 1. Fredagond's Reign of Terror. Fredagond, born around 545 AD, was a Frankish queen whose name became synonymous with ruthless ambition, political cunning, and a chilling series of orchestrated murders and betrayals. Rising from a position as a servant in the household of King Chilperic I of Neustria, she manipulated her way to becoming queen, eliminating anyone who stood in her path. Her life was an ongoing drama of violence and deceit, making her arguably one of the most shocking female figures of the early medieval period. Her initial rise involved the systematic removal of Chilperic's other wives and mistresses. He was married to Autovera, but Fredagond quickly became his mistress. She orchestrated the downfall of Autovera and her daughters. Historical accounts suggest Fredagond then turned her attention to Galswinthe, a Visigothic princess whom Chilperic married for political alliance and a large dowry. Galswinthe was found strangled in her bed around 568 AD, just a short time after her marriage. While Chilperic was likely complicit, suspicion immediately fell upon Fredagond, who married Chilperic almost immediately after Galswinth's death. This act of murder, motivated by a ruthless desire for the crown, was a profound betrayal of the royal court, and a clear signal of her willingness to eliminate any obstacle. Fredagons' rivalry with Brunhild, the sister of the murdered Galswinth and Queen of Austrasia, became the central bloody theme of her life. This feud, fueled by vengeance and a desire for dominance, led to decades of warfare between the Frankish kingdoms. Fredagon constantly sought to undermine Brunhild and her family, often through assassination. In 575, Chilperic's half-brother, King Sigebert I of Austrasia, Brunhild's husband, was assassinated by two of Fredagon's agents while on the verge of victory. This cold-blooded murder was a strategic betrayal designed to remove her most powerful rival and save Chilperic's kingdom. Her betrayals extended even to members of her own family and her adopted royal family. She was intensely jealous of her husband, Chilperic's sons from previous marriages, seeing them as potential threats to her own children's succession. She orchestrated the murders of Chilperic's eldest sons, Merivec and Clovis, whom she viewed as obstacles. Merivec, who had briefly married Brunhild, was relentlessly pursued by Fredagon's agents and eventually killed, either by his own hand or on Fredagon's orders. Clovis was also brutally murdered. She similarly persecuted Chilperic's surviving daughter, Rigunf, often through psychological abuse and physical violence, at one point attempting to drown her by slamming a chest lid onto her neck. These were profound betrayals of stepchildren and familial trust, motivated by a desperate desire to secure her own son Clothar II as the undisputed heir. Fredagond also displayed her ruthlessness in moments of political crisis. When Chilperic I was assassinated in 584, the exact perpetrators are debated, but Fredagond's enemies often implicated her. She immediately took steps to protect her young son, Clothar II. She formed alliances, secured a regency, and skillfully navigated the treacherous political landscape. Her unwavering determination to protect her son's claim, despite the accusations and threats against her, involved constant vigilance and the elimination of any potential enemies, often through covert means. She used poison and daggers to eliminate rivals, not through open warfare, but through insidious means. Fredagond's reign of terror continued until her death in 597. Her cunning, her intelligence, and her utter lack of remorse for the brutal acts she orchestrated allowed her to survive and maintain power in a chaotic era. Her legacy is one of a queen who, driven by an insatiable thirst for power and a fierce protectiveness of her son, consistently betrayed the trust and lives of others, leaving a trail of blood and fear across the Frankish kingdoms. Her numerous assassinations and relentless feuds stand as a chilling example of the extreme lengths a medieval queen would go to secure her position and legacy.